From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will offer his remarks on the USDA's grain supply and demand report this week. That included this month's projections on U.S. corn and soybean production. Dan raises the question of how well the USDA economic models are able to account for the rise in corn ear and soybean pod counts in recent years as it calculates its yield estimates. Then K-State's Terry Griffin and Sara Gammon will talk about an online resource they manage. It maintains a running projection of days suitable for field work in Kansas. They'll explain how you producers can use that information to your advantage. And further ahead on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp, along with much more, right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, our Friday edition. Thanks for tuning in, as always. First off, the takeaways from the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates, which were put out this past week, and that includes the latest updated projections on U.S. row crop production. Dan O'Brien has studied the numbers and offers his comments now, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Well, let's start with the corn figure for the U.S. crop, and that yield number, which was posted this time by the USDA, was beyond expectations and then some, Dan.
Yes, if you look at the pre-report expectations, we had basically the trade, we had an average expectation of about 177.8 bushels per acre, a high yield projection of 180, and ended up in 181.3. So just, quote, blew the top off of expectations. And when you dig back behind that one number and try to look and see what was driving that, the corn objective yield analysis of ears per acre versus implied ear weight showed, in essence, records on both sides, with a ears per acre number of about 29,250 as they plugged that number in, an ear weight figure just a little bit over 0.36, 3,600 pounds per ear, and those numbers would be record highs. So does rain make grain? I've seen some other analysts make that quote, and it sure makes sense in that without question we have moisture through a good chunk of the Corn Belt. And if there's a question on any of this, it will be how we finish. You know, with all this moisture, will we have harvest problems? Will there be some maturity issues? Will the saturated soils bring any issues about that aren't being anticipated? And again, with these USDA numbers, again, we've seen some harvest begin in southern parts of the U.S., but for the most part, you know, places like Wisconsin, Ohio, Illinois are dealing with supersaturated soils with some flooding in places, etc. And we've had some of that in our own state, too, in isolated areas anyway. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. Still, though, if there's a shortage of grain yield this year, it's not coming from a lack of moisture. It would be from excess moisture as we come into the latter part of this marketing year. And on a state-by-state basis, the number that's really a surprise to a lot of folks, I think, was the Illinois number of 214 bushels per acre, up 7 bushels from before. I know coming into this, people from that area were pretty concerned about short grain fill times and how the early ramped-up season may affect how the crop ends up. Again, Iowa also at 206 bushels per acre, Nebraska 198. And here in Kansas, 131, that was up 2 bushels from before, from the August report. So now we head off to the October and November reports, et cetera. But again, absent a surprise this fall from excess moisture or something we're not accounting for right now in that crop, the market is pretty well settling into the idea that we've got a large crop, and really for us now we start asking the question of, well, when do we set a harvest bottom? Again, 14.8 billion bushels is the projection, and that number could grow towards the record of 15.1 or 2 here eventually if there aren't any of these excess moisture issues. And again, when do we start to see the low in the market? And once we see that, then aside from those that because of either cash flow needs or just don't want to store corn or grain sorghum, aside from those, there'll be no doubt a lot of grain put in storage, and people will wait for some type of post-harvest gain, no doubt, to sell their crops. And then what we're really anticipating right now is setting up for some type of a normal seasonal large crop price pattern. Again, a harvest low sometime in the fall, followed by moves of 10, 15 cents higher, et cetera. Could be exacerbated by South American issues. We don't know yet. But absent any other issues, you see the market tend to recover just enough to entice sales because people will have to buy this stuff to run livestock feeding, ethanol plants, exports, you name it. So that seems to be right now probably the most judicious estimate of the type of a marketing year we'd be seeing heading off into fall of 2018 and on into the winter and spring months of 2019.
So if there's to be a positive jolt to the corn market, the feed grain markets anytime soon, it'll have to come down on the demand side of the equation.
Well, I think that's right. And the USDA did not back off at all on its demand projections when you look at its 2018-19 projections for supply-demand. Strong livestock feeding, ethanol use, export numbers, et cetera. So those figures will have to prove themselves out. They'll have to come to the table to keep us from ending up with ending stocks. Well, they're projected now about 1.7, 1.8 billion bushels. If demand would fall short and we start scaling back usage to get to the place where we have 2.25 billion bushels, then it'll just be a rougher sales year for corn, that's for sure, heading off into the late winter and spring of next year.
Now, as for the soybean production numbers from the USDA out Wednesday, while still hefty, more in line with pre-report projections.
Not as much of a surprise, again, with the moisture as it was, and I think the general thought that if there was some type of a early summer impact on the crop, it would be more likely to hit corn than beans. Still, we came in with a projection of just about 4.7 billion bushels, and of course that's a record high. It was above last year's number of about 4.4, 4.3 in 2016, and back in 2015 and 14 when we were thinking someday we might see 4 billion bushels. Well, now for about 3 years in a row we've had it for beans. So you've got that coming in, and yields, again, just looking at the lineup of yields across that central part of the U.S. Corn Belt, 58 bushel per acre projected in Ohio, 60 in Indiana, 66 in Illinois, 60 in Iowa, 62 in Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas, not quite as good, 41 Kansas bushel per acre projected, up 5 from the August number, and 47 in Missouri. Again, given all the problems that Missouri had until these late rains, it's amazing that they've come up and they're projecting that number in Missouri. So strong production projections on a state-by-state basis. In terms of the overall calculations used by the USDA for their soybean objective yields, they have pods per 18 square feet versus implied pod weight. The pods per 18 square feet is sort of in the range of where we've been, somewhere about 1,775 pods per 18 square feet, and that's about in the range of where we were in 2014 and 15. 16, we were a lot higher than that, up to 1,875. But what's surprisingly good this year is the grams per pod, or the weight per pod, again, projected to be about 0.34, 34 hundredths, I guess, grams per pod. The highest we'd seen in the past was about 32, 33. So as economists, as we study forecasting, et cetera, when you see a circumstance that's so far outside of your realm of experience, and you're applying models to that, yield models to them in this case, and you could say the same thing for corn, when you're projecting so far outside of what you've experienced in the past and doing linear projections off of that, how accurate are you when you're projecting that far out? So that's a question I would have. Again, nobody's saying that, gosh, we're not going to have great yields this year. But the numbers and the calculations that we're using to get these high corn and soybean yields are out there far enough that you wonder about the forecast accuracy. But again, that's my thought, given my own background in ag economics.
Point again, though, for row crops in general, producers are going to have to be watchful for what might be short-lived marketing opportunities as they would pop up on a daily, maybe an hourly basis in lieu of the fact or the appearance that the post-harvest rally may well be elusive.
I would say that there's another clue that the markets are giving with regard to what they think will happen. We look at the carrying charges now for soybean futures. From the November contract to January, it's up to basically 7 cents a bushel. From January to March, about 6.4 cents a bushel per month. From March to May, about the same. And normally, when we have strong demand for beans, for exports, gosh, there's no carry, just flat. Well, now the market is basically dialing in carrying charges that don't look far different from what hard red winter wheat has with its variable storage rate mechanism. And why is that? Well, there's just a lot of fear and trepidation about the future of demand for beans. Not so much, I would think, for crush, domestic crush, but really these questions that are haunting the market about the potential resolution of U.S.-China trade issues, and really another factor now, the swine disease that they have over in China that could very well bring a major hit to their soybean demand, period. You bring those factors into play, and the market, with these increased carrying charges, is basically signaling that they're trying to push supplies out later on into the marketing year in hopes that something else will happen to eventually bring about demand and help them move those beans. But for right now, they're given every signal to store. So maybe that's a new question we have to deal with now. How long do we want to hold on to soybeans in storage? And we'll see what Kansas elevators and Kansas farmers do with that issue.
Thanks, Dan, once more. We'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. And this is Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Right here, we want to let you know about a collection of information which is updated weekly out of the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. And what it tracks is the days suitable for field work in Kansas. We'll explain what's behind that and how it can be of use to you producers right here. Agricultural economist Terry Griffin of K-State is along, as is an undergraduate researcher here at the university who's involved with this particular project, Sara Gammon. Terry, this is something that was launched, 3 or 4 years ago now, this data that you've been pulling together on this topic?
I've been involved with this project this is the 4th season. We started when I arrived at Kansas State in February 2015. Prior to that, though, Jeff Williams and Rich Llewellyn in our department had some fact sheets around this, and as well as Dr. Bueller. He had a publication a couple of decades ago regarding days suitable for field work in Kansas. So I picked it up when I arrived and been working on it for this 4th season.
And the inspiration behind going through this exercise, what is it exactly?
So we all know that there's 7 days in a week, and it's unrealistic to plan for being able to get into the field and plant or harvest crops 7 days a week. So it's somewhere between 0 and 7. So the data were collected and analyzed such that we could make predictions on how many days we should be able to expect to get into the field on average, or in a really good year, or this fall is considered sort of a bad year. Last 4 weeks we've been below average for the number of days that we could get into the field.
This is a running prediction now. It changes week by week then?
Well, every week we get a new observation for the previous week, and we're plotting that against the long-term trends. And those long-term trends go from 1978 to last year, 2017. So it's 30-something years there that we built these probability distributions, for the median, average. And I'm using a 20th percentile as a bad year, so 20 years out of 100 would have fewer days than that, and 80 years out of 100 would have more. And the median would be half and half. Half would be better.
And Sara, you're the data handler, if you will, for this. Exactly what all goes into this as you pull it together?
So each week when the USDA releases their Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report, I look at that document and I take the days suitable for fieldwork number that they provide, and then I put it into a Google Sheets, and then that automatically will update the graph on Ag Manager.
Basically, the program takes it from there once you plug in the numbers. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, the data come from a survey of university extension personnel, USDA field staff. Up until 2017, USDA NASS reported this for each of the 9 crop reporting districts. But in 2018, it's only for the state level. They've always reported it for the state, but now it's only for the state of Kansas. The data are, like I said, they're a survey, so it's not directly measured, but things do affect this. So think about what does affect being able to get into the field to harvest or plant. Well, precipitation, how much did it rain, and how quickly can it dry, the evapotranspiration rates, function of temperature, sunlight, maybe soil texture, whether the field's no-till and so forth. There's a lot of factors that can affect this, but ultimately what gets measured is a survey of field experts about how many days they see farmers conducting field work in their respective areas. It rained a lot over Labor Day weekend.
Right.
Over that weekend, most of the state received substantial amount of rainfall, and that caused us to pay closer attention to the days suitable that was released Tuesday this week. And when we plotted it, it was, Sara, how many days?
1.8.
Which was about 4 less than median. So it was definitely a severe impact on being able to get into the field and harvest crops.
But up until these recent rains, Sara, those days suitable for field work have been more available, right?
Right. The previous week was 5 days suitable for field work. And so when you have rain, kind of skews a little bit if you're able to get into the field. And since the data is on the statewide level instead of by crop reporting district, it's a little more difficult to use that data and apply it because each region of the state is so different in the weather that they receive.
Often on this broadcast, we allude to the climate and weather resources that are based right here at K-State out of the Weather Data Library at the university called Mesonet. Do you utilize that information to factor into the days suitable for fieldwork calculations?
Well, we do not directly. The days suitable data comes directly from USDA Ag Statistics. But the data that Kansas Mesonet reports does impact those values that USDA provides to us. And when we look at days suitable last week with the 1.8 days, overlay that with the Kansas Mesonet for the the month-wide precipitation, and it's quite fascinating how obviously they link up.
How, Terry, can producers make the maximum use of this information, given that it is a statewide based number? What can it really say to the producer?
We're using this for a couple different ways. So for the long-term probabilities, we're using this to figure out how many days over the typical planting or harvest period for each crop that we should have. We're looking at it on average as well as what we would consider a bad year. And this tells us that, well, if you have a 3 or 4 week period that we want to plant corn or harvest a crop, how many days should we expect to be able to get in the field? This is where we figure out how big of equipment we need in order to make those field operations happen in a timely manner. So that's the economic question. How much can we afford, and how much yield penalty, let's say, can we assume if we're willing to plant or harvest outside of the best windows?
Mm-hmm. Now, Terry, again, you've been conducting this particular service, to put it in that way, For 4 years now, 4 growing seasons. What's been the response? Have you found producers have taken advantage of this information?
They have. So on Ag Manager, we do track the number of hits and so forth that we get. And I mean, it's pretty clear that when sun's shining and people are in the field 6 or 7 days a week, they're not going to it too often. But when the weather's bad for field work, then that's when we get most of our hits. And it's not just producers. I get phone calls from ag lenders, the local bankers trying to decide what's a reasonable amount of equipment, especially for some new or at-risk farms when they're trying to make loans. And it's not just farmers who are interested in this. If you look at other states, most states are doing something similar to what we're doing in Kansas. Actually, I'm doing it I built it for Oklahoma, and they're maintaining it. They're at the Ag Econ department. But a lot of states spend some time doing some analysis over these types of data for their clientele.
So it's serving as a benchmark, if you will, for other states, other interests, as a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm. And I obviously wasn't the first. Dr. Bueller here in Kansas, but some other states have gone back 100 years of this type of data. Not all states had it going back that far. In Kansas, I have access going back to 1978, which is pretty good time, but it's not, long enough to actually do climate change type analyses. But it is good for determining what weather probabilities we should be able to expect for a given year.
As you've been doing this for a few years now, compare what it looks like right now heading into the fall with what you've seen in previous late summer, early fall periods, wheat planting time and so forth.
Well, right now for 2018, we're further behind on days suitable than we have since I've been in Kansas. As Sara mentioned last week, we had roughly 5, but for the last 4 weeks, we were below median. Last week was 1.8. We were severely below even what we would consider a bad year. So we're behind the mark on being able to get into the field right now. But, the question is, how many days will we have next week? Today's a beautiful day in Manhattan. I suspect the rest of Kansas is doing fine as well.
And that's the point. This does change as the weather conditions and the patterns change. So that's why you're keeping up with it on a regular basis, Sara.
Yeah.
Where can producers, to ask you, find this information then?
They can go to Ag Manager, and then if they type in the search just days suitable for field work, it should pop up, and then the graph is interactive, and the statewide is at the top, and so you can see the different points on the graph and how many days suitable there were for that week.
Sara's been active on Twitter every week, putting up a screenshot off of Ag Manager and tweeting it out, and I've been interacting with it as well, retweeting under my Twitter handle of Space Plowboy.
So you can find it in social media platforms as well, very handily. But it's something, in closing, Terry, that it's rather straightforward, but it can be of value to a producer as they plan out not only their potential for getting in the field, but to make those decisions on investments and equipment. That's highly important.
Exactly right. Machinery investment is one of the factors that I pay attention to that can cause a difference between a farmer being in upper and lower profitability categories. So, yes, it's an important thing to understand your weather risk and how to manage your equipment accordingly.
Very well. Well, again, it's tracked regularly on agmanager.info. Sara, good luck with continuing to gather the data and plugging it in. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And Terry, likewise as well.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
Over from the Agricultural Economics Department here at K-State, Terry Griffin, who is a precision agricultural economist at K-State and an undergraduate researcher there, Sara Gammon, who is responsible for handling the data that goes into the weekly calculations on days suitable for field work here in the state of Kansas. Have a look at it, producers, on agmanager.info. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. More is coming your way in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today resumes now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here as we turn to today's agricultural news page and these headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. President Trump took to Twitter yesterday to blame Senate Agriculture Committee ranking member Debbie Stabenow for preventing the Farm Bill from being completed. Stabenow and the Democrats are totally against approving the Farm Bill, the president tweeted. Stabenow, however, countered with a tweet of her own pointing out, quoting here, the Senate passed a bipartisan farm bill that got 86 votes, the most ever, read the tweet. Meantime, House Agriculture Committee Chairman Mike Conaway welcomed the president's remarks, telling reporters that Stabenow has, quoting here, got to come to the table, and so far, from my perspective, I'm not getting the kind of negotiating out of her that gets us to a deal, in Conaway's words once more. However, indications are that the nutrition program area is not the only portion of the bill where House and Senate negotiators remain apart, and Senate Ag Committee Chairman Pat Roberts has already signaled the potential for getting the bill done before the end of September is getting less likely. The USDA used a three-step process to determine damages caused by unfair trade practices deployed by U.S. trading partners against U.S. agriculture, setting the stage for the efforts the USDA has announced, including the Market Facilitation Program. The three steps the USDA used are like those used in other trade disputes, according to a white paper issued by the Office of the Chief Economist. It noted this was the same process used in the country of origin labeling dispute case. The WTO awarded trade damages of approximately $1 billion to Canada and Mexico based on the gross trade value of their lost livestock exports to the U.S. due to the cool measure, the white paper said. The efforts focused on countries putting retaliatory tariffs in place on U.S. agricultural products, including China, Canada, the European Union, Mexico, and Turkey. Now, the three steps specifically, trade value without the retaliatory tariff from a particular country was one step. Step two was trade value with the retaliatory tariff from a particular country. And step three, taking the difference of the two as the trade damage due to the tariff. The office used actual 2017 trade data as a proxy for the expected value of trade without the retaliatory tariff, using the import data from Canada, China, the EU, Mexico, and Turkey. While a WTO case unfolds over time, allowing for several years of trade data to be used, the effort the USDA pursued used a global trade model to estimate what the value of trade is expected to be after the imposition of the tariffs. And a Texas court has issued an injunction against the 2015 Waters of the United States, or WOTUS rule, as a result of a South Carolina court's recent ruling. That rule was in effect in 26 states and on hold in 24 states. The South Carolina court last month ruled that the EPA did not follow Administrative Procedures Act rules in finalizing its rule to delay the 2015 WOTUS for 2 years. On Wednesday, the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas in Galveston granted the request for a temporary injunction of the rule in Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. As a result of this latest ruling, WOTUS is now on hold in 27 states, including Kansas, Texas, Missouri, and Nebraska. The 2015 rule remains in effect in 23 states, including Oklahoma. The Texas court ruling came after the Texas Attorney General's office wrote a letter to the court requesting a decision on the three states, or those three states would appeal to a higher court. In its ruling on Wednesday, the court said it issued the ruling primarily because it was in the public interest. Well, the wheat breeding program here at Kansas State University has generated numerous new varieties over the past several years that are living up to their promise in Kansas fields. One of the agronomists largely responsible for their development has been monitoring their performance and offers his variety recommendations to you producers on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Here's Marcia Boswell.
As wheat farmers look toward planting, there are a number of variety options to choose from. But Kansas State University wheat breeder Alan Fritz says there are some varieties that come to the top in each area of the state.
For instance, I think in south central Kansas, I think both Larry and Zenda fit really well.
Zenda and Larry are two varieties that were developed in Fritz's breeding program at K-State. He says Zenda, which has been called the Everest replacement, is recommended for all of central and eastern Kansas, and is generally significantly better than Everest for a number of characteristics.
When I look at the data, Zenda's done really well in sort of our ambient growing conditions where we haven't applied fungicide. So the disease package is very strong. It has very good stripe rust resistance. It has good leaf rust resistance, has pretty good tan spot resistance, and again, it has the fusarium resistance very similar to Everest.
Fritz says Larry has also performed well.
Larry has just been a really good, consistent performer for us during development, and as we start to look at some of the data from the variety tests over kind of a 3 or a 4 year time span, Larry's just been a very strong performer. So in south central Kansas, when you average it over those 3 or 4 years, Larry's at the very top.
In western Kansas, a different set of varieties take over the top of Fritz's recommendations.
As you go into western Kansas, then we start to worry about other things, drought tolerance, wheat streak, some of those sort of things. And so, there's just a different set of varieties that are a good fit out there.
Wheat streak mosaic virus has been an issue in western Kansas over the past few years, causing a conservative $76.8 million in direct losses to wheat farmers in 2017. While there are a few varieties with some resistance to wheat streak mosaic virus or the wheat curl mite, Fritz says the best way to mitigate the virus is to control volunteer wheat.
If you can encourage your neighbor to control their volunteer, that's great. Obviously, you can't force people to do things. Somewhat delaying planting a little bit can help, but really you're kind of looking at what are your options in terms of varieties that stand up to wheat streak a little bit better. So there's some things with tolerance, there's some things with resistance, with curl mite.
K-State has 2 varieties with resistance to wheat streak mosaic virus, including the hard white wheat, Joe, and the hard red winter wheat, Oakley CL. Joe has a well-stocked disease package indicating resistance to stripe rust, leaf rust, and wheat streak mosaic virus. Joe is a strong variety and a high yielder for western Kansas.
We've really tried to make sure that when we bring something forward through KWA that it's really what we think is a really good fit for production and has real value on acres.
For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. K-State's Mary Knapp is standing by to share the latest on the Kansas agricultural weather outlook with us next on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Now for you on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather and the latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State. Mike's side is Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. Let's begin with what has been the obvious attention getter here weather-wise in the nation the last several days, Mary. Hurricane Florence now coming ashore in the Carolinas. Thankfully for us here in the Central Plains, likely very little influence to our conditions, but still a gargantuan weather event.
Right, and it's going to be lingering. Those impacts are going to linger for some time. Some people focus on whether it was a Category 1 or a Category 4 as it made landfall. It's important to note those categories are determined by the wind, and the wind quite often isn't the major factor in fatalities in those storms. It's the rainfall and the flooding that accompanies that. And that was the case in Katrina. It was the case in Harvey. And you can look at it in many cases. It's that flooding that is deadly. And with the slow pace that the hurricane is taking and its interaction with the land surfaces in the Carolinas, flooding is going to be a big problem. And as that meanders inland, that could likely be a problem as it moves into Tennessee, Kentucky, maybe in the Ohio River Valley. We noted here in Kansas last week the problems that we had with flooding with a 10-inch rain in the area. Imagine getting 10 inches in half a day and have that continue for 5 days, which is basically what they're looking at. The area that it's making landfall at had been on the dry side going into the storm, but as you move into the Ohio River Valley area, they've had a very wet summer, and the capacity to absorb a tropical storm system worth of rainfall is not as great. So there's likely to be problems coming from that for the next week or more.
Yeah, so thoughts and prayers to those folks who are going to endure that storm here in the coming days, and hopefully the damage and the issues will be minimized. We shall see. We are coming off of a wet week here in Kansas this past week, up until early week anyway, and then it's been a run of dry days, Mary.
Right. When we look at our week, we work on a week that ends on Tuesday because that is what feeds into the U.S. Drought Monitor. And the week ending on the 11th was wetter than normal statewide. The driest division was the Northwest. They averaged 38/100ths of an inch, which was exactly normal. Not very often do we get to say that, but that's what happened. The Southeast, which was the last area for the system to leave the state from our last round, averaged 3.47 inches, which was just over 3 3/4 times their normal rainfall. So almost 400% of normal. Very, very wet in that area. So again, it was a wet week, but the relief from the drought was limited. We saw in the Southeast, which saw the heaviest rainfall and which was in a moderate drought, pretty much is drought-free at this time. In the East Central and the western parts of the East Central in particular, we still have severe to extreme drought. The rainfalls were not as heavy in that area as they were in the Manhattan area. Ponds are still low. They're still hauling water. So it's still an issue. And as you go to the Kansas City area, the Leavenworth, Wyandotte, northern Johnson County areas also missed out on much of the rain, and so they are still in exceptional drought. So despite being a wet week, the improvements have not erased the drought in the state. And again, we need to keep in mind that the roots of this drought go back to our winter and the dry conditions there. So it's not surprising that it's going to take an extended period of above normal rainfall to completely alleviate the situation.
And we'll pick up on the rain prospects in just a second. We've had a cool down in Kansas as well.
Right. September started out on the cool side. When we look at the week ending again on the September 11th, we averaged about 3 degrees cooler than normal for the period. So not what would help get the milo or the sorghum finished off, but kind of a nice break otherwise. We've warmed up in the last couple of days, and it's expected that this week going into next week will be warmer than normal, and we're looking at highs in the upper 80s to the low 90s, not oppressively hot, but certainly warmer than we typically see at this time of the year. The other thing is what we might see some warmer nighttime lows as indicative of those higher humidities. With that, we're looking at lows in the mid-60s, where commonly at this time of the year we'd have them in the upper 50s, low 60s.
And by the sound of it, we are looking at a stretch of dry weather yet through next week.
Right. When we look at the 8 to 14-day outlook, it calls for wetter than normal. But when we look at the quantitative precip forecasts, the first 5 days of the week are basically zero for the moisture. Might get a sprinkle here or there, but it's looking to be dry. When we get into that day 6 and 7, we start seeing better chances of moisture, and the best chances are in the eastern parts of the state, where they may see as much as an inch along the Nebraska border. So again, a return to a little bit wetter pattern as we get into the latter part of the period.
And as we round out the month of September then, more of the same? What?
Really not a whole lot of guidance on that as to what will happen. They have some rain advisories along the Texas Gulf Coast. Those are the kind of systems that are more likely to bring tropical moisture up into the central plains. And then the question will be what happens with cold fronts that are out to our west. There's a ridge right now that's holding. If that begins to deteriorate, we could get a cold wave coming in, interacting with that tropical moisture, and of course bringing us rain. So
it's all about the timing, right?
All about the timing, and we'll watch to see what happens. Again, we'll be focusing on the Caribbean rather than the Atlantic.
Very well. Mary, enjoy your weekend. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
Our regular Friday guest, as she shares the latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State, Mary Knapp, Research and Extension Climatologist. And thanks to you as well for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.